All right, YouTube, and happy news for today. The New Hampshire House has decided to decriminalize marijuana, and the vote wasn't even close. It was, I think it was 300 and something to 30 or thereabouts, so it wasn't even remotely close. Now, the House in New Hampshire has voted before to decriminalize marijuana, and the Senate keeps blocking it, but this time around it looks like the Senate will probably approve it. The governor has already come out, John Sununu, who's a Republican. No, he's more like a Rand Paul, I guess, in many ways than he is a Mitch Bitch McConnell or a John McLean or something like that. He's come out in support of it. He's like, yeah, I'll sign it if it comes to my desk. I'll decriminalize marijuana, which would put them on par with Vermont. This would really help regionally, even on this side of the Connecticut River with some of our problems. Right now, Vermont's got decriminalized marijuana for under an ounce. If you have under an ounce of marijuana in this state, you're not going to get in trouble for it. If you're driving under the influence, still a DUI. If you're smoking it in public, it's still public intoxication. It can be an aggravating factor in any crime you commit while you're high on marijuana. It can certainly be considered by a court. But if you're simply in your home, you got a little green bag and you're smoking a pipe, nobody really fucking cares. Like basically they're asking you, don't drive under the influence, don't do it in public, do it in your own home on your own time. Don't do it around your kids, stuff like that. Otherwise, nobody really cares in this state. And it hasn't caused a crime epidemic. Our problem is opiate related, has nothing to do with marijuana. Having it decriminalized here has been helpful because then our police don't have to be sent to some home at midnight to crash in a door and potentially get shot at because they're raiding somebody for smoking a bong or something like that. It's been very helpful for our state. It's caused no significant problems. It solves many more problems than it causes. Ultimately, decriminalization, although it's often a step to legalization, I would say in and of itself is almost perfectly fine. Because you're simply saying small amounts of possession, personal use, we're not going to prosecute it. At most, you're going to get a fine. If you're doing it openly, if you're being dumb about it, yeah, you might get your weed confiscated and have to pay a small fine. And that's essentially what happens. New Hampshire is a very libertarian state. There's a free state project, actually, that seeks to import, 50,000 or 100,000 libertarians to New Hampshire to essentially seize the government of the state through political activism, which I support. That would be good to have a state, one state in the United States that can serve as a model for this. Before it's taken up on a national stage, it should be tested at the state level to see how viable it really is. When you consider other states will hold out against such ideologies, even under the most libertarian of situations, there will be states that are still far blue, they're run by neoliberals, that are very red, they're very traditionalist. We need to see whether libertarianism can survive in such a situation. We need to view what happens to the economy of New Hampshire if that actually takes hold. I'm optimistic. Libertarianism, in the sense of the Libertarian Party, is basically dead. I will say that. The Libertarian Party is no longer really a libertarian movement. A lot of libertarians appear to have significant difficulties with the platforms that they actually used during this last election. It made them viable among centrists, but also absorbed a lot of, really, ultimately, Bernie Sanders socialists into the movement, which I don't support. I think it's retarded. But that being said, if anyone's going to do it next, yeah, it should be New Hampshire, our twin state, which is basically like an upside down, more populated Vermont with lower taxes, very gun friendly, generally quite socially permissive, economically far right. They're the only state as well where the concept of jury nullification can be brought up in court. Usually, a lawyer is unable to instruct the jury, oh, yeah, by the way, you have the right to declare my client not guilty because you think that the crime that they committed isn't or shouldn't be a crime. In New Hampshire, you can do that. Nowhere else can you. Which I have respect for because it is an important tool in keeping government accountable at the judicial level, preventing bad laws from being enforced. I look at it as a constitutional issue. I think it's a good thing. But decriminalizing marijuana should take hold in more states. And we've already achieved the tipping point. You can look at, I believe it's Oklahoma actually just voted to restore felony charges for simple possession. Sort of a step in the wrong direction. They've overridden the voters. The voters by ballot decided, yeah, we're going to bump it down to a simple misdemeanor charge, essentially de facto decriminalization. The House and Senate there, of course, voted to reverse that and say, nope, nope, the people can't have their way. And it doesn't really matter, though. It's like this debate over, well, is Trump pro-pod, is Trump anti-pod? I don't think that he has strong opinions in either direction. I think he sees it as a states' rights issue. It doesn't matter what the federal government at this point chooses to do about marijuana. Too many states have already legalized it. Many more have legalized it for medical purposes, at least. Others, like Vermont and now probably New Hampshire, Vermont has decriminalized it. New Hampshire is probably about to decriminalize it. We've gone a step beyond their ability to enforce federal marijuana guidelines. It's no longer possible. There are too many states where it's legal. When we're talking about Washington State, Colorado, and Alaska alone, we're talking about massive land areas with many rural populations in which the state will no longer willingly aid federal law enforcement to actually go after somebody who's growing a couple of pot plants. It makes their job virtually impossible. Even in a state like Vermont or New Hampshire, which is much smaller, it's the difficulty enforcing such things without the will of the states behind them renders it an ineffective federal law. And what you could see is the exportation of that sort of jury nullification-based activism from New Hampshire, if they decriminalize, to elsewhere. Specifically, what would happen is it would set you up for a second end of prohibition style scenario. Remember, when prohibition was imposed in this country, it was not particularly popular. It was supported by none other than a bunch of feminists and fire and brimstone preachers. That is, the religious moralists got together with the sex moralists of the second wave feminist movement and decided they didn't want men to be drunk. And now the fire and brimstone ministers saw it as a eugenic-style social ill in general. The women said, well, we want our men to be clean-shaven and sober because they shouldn't be drinking, they should be earning more money so they can buy us more bonnets, essentially. It was a very self-serving movement at the time. It had very little to do with suffrage, even though these movements tended to overlap because of the constituents thereof. So they imposed prohibition, and almost immediately it creates essentially just a black market for moonshine. You had the last few vineyards in California that didn't rip out their grapes. They're like, oh, well, the grape prices might rise, so I might as well stick it in. They decided to sell essentially what amounts to dried box wine, where they'd take the basics. They'd give you a packet of yeast and instructions on what not to do if you didn't want it to ferment. And the idea was, of course, you'd mix this stuff together and leave it in a cool, dark place and let it ferment because you wanted this wine. No, then you had the medical establishment revolted and started prescribing people medicinal brandy, which is essentially saying, yeah, I get my patients drunk because who fucking cares? And by the way, I can make money doing this. And it became untenable, and jury nullification kicked in. And what happened is that even people who were absolutely fucking guilty of breaking the law, who absolutely provably on record in every possible way were moonshiners, were let go of anyway. They were declared not guilty. The jury would come out almost instantly saying, yeah, well, we found him not guilty. There's not enough evidence. Yeah, prohibition sucks. Let's go get a drink, essentially. Let's go to the speakeasy or something like that. You could see a situation like that with marijuana, where increasingly people simply refuse to consider people guilty for things like simple possession or anything marijuana related. And that would be something that I would support. Yeah, if I were on a jury, and this is to let people within the state know that on this token, I would probably not be considered proper for jury duty. Much as it would please me to let somebody off on something that I don't believe is actually a crime, or to nail them to the wall if they're actually like legit criminal. I probably will never serve on a jury because I've spoken of jury nullification before, and I am, of course, now. My preference is DUI laws absolutely should be enforced. If someone's smoking weed and driving around, that's not acceptable. If somebody is smoking it around children, that's not acceptable. They're exposing them to that substance. They shouldn't be doing that. If somebody's publicly intoxicated or they get violent while being high, yeah, it could be considered an aggravating factor. I'm not sure about the settled science on it, but it should be enforced anyway. The law should be blind on it. However, if somebody is simply smoking some weed in their apartment, they're not bothering anybody else, they're not exposing anybody else to it, I don't see that as a crime. Sorry, there are some people, and some of them are on this channel, who say, oh no, weed should be illegal because gateway drug, which is completely wrong. You should study the subject, and you'll find out that marijuana is actually usually taken up after other drugs are already being used to suppress nausea and increase appetite, actually. It's a way for people going through opiate withdrawal to deal with their symptoms in many cases. Now, it's not a gateway drug. It does not cause significant long-term harm. It is addictive in the sense of being potentially something you can become chemically dependent upon, although it's not common. It's certainly capable of something you can be habituated to. I smoked marijuana in the past. I never got habituated to it because I only smoked it occasionally anyway. I was more interested in the other psychotropics of the world. Ultimately, it was spice, a perfectly legal substance at the time, that fucked me up. It wasn't marijuana. When I was smoking that, I was coherent like I am now. I was able to do the work that I was doing. I would say that wasting your money on marijuana is, it's kind of dumb. But then again, we let people drink. We let them smoke tobacco. Here I'll submit something for you to think about. The two general excuses used by the drug warriors are marijuana will cause addiction, or marijuana itself may not be a problem, but it can cause, problems with your family and cause you to be lazy or something, and you have societal responsibilities. Well, tobacco certainly fulfills the first quality to a much greater degree. It's highly addictive. It's also destructive of the person's body. If your argument is, oh, the person's hurting themselves and society needs to step in and keep them from doing that, then you should be pushing to outlaw tobacco and alcohol, which will never happen. And alcohol certainly causes a great deal of problems in society. Now, I'm not arguing for outlawing alcohol. I drink occasionally. Although I've cut way down because it just starts making you feel lazy after a while. And honestly, I'd rather not get too far beyond sobriety, because sometimes there's breaking news. I want to make a video about it, and I don't want to be like drunk off my ass and have to wait for several hours sobering up, and then I'm making a video while I've got a headache or something like that. It's just not worth my time. I'd rather invest it in other things. Rather invested in, equipment, invested in books or something like that. It gives me more joy anyway. I'm going to go buy more cow shit for the garden or something along those lines. But at the same time, it's essentially, there's no debate to be had. Alcohol is killing hundreds of thousands of people a year directly and indirectly. It is basically a poison. Cannabis is not particularly toxic in any way, shape, or form. It's also not particularly powerful. A lot of these people weighing in on whether pot should or should not be legal or decriminalized or medically established as significant have never used it. Or they used it like 30 years ago, apparently forgot how it is. You're going to have to smoke quite a bit of marijuana to be truly inebriated beyond your capacity to operate in a normal manner. You're going to have to be pretty high for that to take place, especially if you smoked it for some time. The first few times you use marijuana, you're like, whoa, man, it's so powerful. Man, I feel great. It's hippie-trippy, and you're sitting there talking about Play-Doh or something. And then months later, after a few more uses, you're like, oh, yeah, I want a Twinkie or something like that. That's essentially what it does to you. The idea of a lot of people say, oh, well, pot is more powerful now than it was in the past. Okay, well, then smoke a little bit less pot. There's your answer. Instead of greening out and, vomiting all over yourself or something like that. No, this substance is not a societal ill. I hate to sound like a hippie, but it is quite literally just a plant. People have been using it for thousands of years. As far as I know of, there is still, to this day, no case where marijuana alone has killed somebody unless they had some significant underlying medical condition. Whether it causes lung cancer or not depends on which medical group you ask and which person you ask. I guess it's up in the air. I don't even care. If it does, how does that make it different from tobacco? Only it happens to be far less addictive and tends to be something people don't use as often. Someone's addicted to tobacco and they're chain smoking 2-3 packs a day. How many marijuana smokers do you know that are smoking more than a couple of joints in a day's period. Probably not that many. Even very heavy pot smokers aren't smoking that much material. As to, oh yeah, but it's unfiltered and therefore more tar or whatever, you think that it's impossible to literally roll a cigarette with marijuana? You think it's impossible to construct a water bong or something like that? Of course it is. There are ways to filter that too. I haven't used marijuana, I think, in half a decade or so. But at the same time, the fact that I gave it up because it doesn't do anything for me and I don't want to use it doesn't mean that I want to put other people in jail for using it. That's tax money too. Look at the economic side. You're throwing a bunch of people, oh, these horrible weed smokers in prison. You're paying through the nose to keep them in prison. You realize how expensive that is, right? Keep somebody in the average prison costs more than the average yearly salary in some states. You know, what's the median income in your state? It might cost more to put somebody in prison than the average person even pulls in. You need 4 or 5 people with that income to actually carry that tax burden just to keep somebody locked up. It's useless. And that's just on the side of imprisonment. You also have to pay for people. You have to pay for public defenders and judges in the judicial system. They're taking on those cases. You're paying for prison guards and their salaries. You're paying for policing, both in terms of actually expending the manpower and the money you're paying to do so. Even gas mileage on going to the scene of the crime, so-called, when somebody's smoking a joint. Now, it shouldn't be considered a crime at all. It should be considered something that ultimately is a fairly weak drug. It kind of is a waste of time, but if somebody is entertained by smoking marijuana and they're not harming others in doing so, I don't care. It shouldn't matter. It's not society's business what people do with their own bodies. I would even extend that to other substances. Somebody decides to take shrooms. Not bothering me. If they attack me while they're on shrooms, that's a problem. But then again, it's going to be a problem if they attack me sober. So what the hell do I care? What's the difference between the two? We should look at the established scientific evidence behind these substances and their effects before we attempt to design legalese. The problem is we designed the anti-drug system for marijuana many, many decades ago, long before the science was actually in on the effects of the substance. People just assumed that it would cause you to crash your car and rape your girlfriend. You look at reefer madness. If you've ever seen reefer madness while high, it's actually hilarious because it's just so absurd. But that appears to be the basis for all of our convoluted drug war laws. It takes off from marijuana and sort of the anti-opium thing and the prohibition thing, and it just spiraled out of control from there. And most of these lurid tales that you've ever heard of, oh, little Jimmy was a straight-A student and he smoked weed and now he's in the poorhouse, most of that is a bunch of bullshit. In fact, many times people's lives weren't ruined by the drug themselves. It was ruined by society's reaction when it was found that they were doing drugs, in terms of jobs they didn't get, scholarships they didn't get, and whatever else. I would think that if you actually thought they were an addict and that they had a problem, you'd put them in rehab and let them continue to have access to these things and not treat them like a human scum for choosing to smoke marijuana. What about smoking tobacco? Tobacco smokers, who tend as a group to be lean at least slightly towards the conservative side. Red states have higher rates of smoking. Those individuals, would you like it if you're a tobacco smoker to be denied jobs because you happen to be smoking tobacco? No, I think you'd cry about discrimination. Well, how is it any different? That substance you're using is addictive, is toxic, potentially does cause harm to others. I don't believe in like the third-hand smoke crap that they're spewing now. Second-hand smoke, I guess it depends on if you're in an enclosed area. Yeah, you shouldn't be smoking around your kids in the car. I agree with that. I don't have a problem with that being banned. If you're smoking, outside, it's not hurting anybody. But at the same time, it is fundamentally similar to marijuana. It is relatively similar. The inebriation that comes from smoking at the average quantity of marijuana is not enough to cause people to make truly stupid decisions beyond eating the wrong foods or being lazy. And if somebody wants to take something that makes them lazy, hell, we let people take NyQuil. We give people painkillers like candy anytime they have minor surgery. I can remember when I got my wisdom teeth out, they handed me a big-ass bottle of Percocet that I couldn't take, by the way, because it made me too nauseous. I took one of them, and then I just switched off, and I said, I'm going to use the ibuprofen instead, and it worked better anyway. So it's like, why the fuck do I want these? In retrospect, it's probably about $500 worth of Percocet for pain that lasted a few days. It was very, very strange. This is what they used to do. That was back before we really started looking at the problems of opiate addiction in this country. Um, yeah, marijuana should be decriminalized in New Hampshire. Why shouldn't it be? It's been decriminalized here. Why, if the Senate of New Hampshire is still on the fence, look at Vermont. It's been decriminalized here for several years. No significant problems. I know people that smoke pot. They're perfectly well adjusted. They do their work. They have their jobs. They have their families and stuff. It doesn't turn them into zombies. It doesn't turn them into monsters and criminals. They're just normal people that happen to be smoking pot. And so I don't understand the whole drug war thing. The drug war is made by people who have never even experienced any of these substances that they claim to know so much about. Nor have they read, in many cases, actual studies of them, because for many years there were no studies coming from the US on these subjects, or from Western Europe. They were all coming from Scandinavia or other parts of the world that, at least on the medical side, were allowed to test them. You have all these Swedish and Norwegian studies on the topic, but you don't have much from the US unless you go back to the pre-drug war era, which leads up to it, where the supposition was, yes, these substances are incredibly dangerous. They're a social ill. They cause madness. In some cases, they claimed. Of course, we now know that doesn't actually happen. So people should make their own decisions, take responsibility for their own bodies. If they're harming others, yeah, go ahead and enforce the law. Otherwise, there shouldn't be a law against specifically simply using these materials. That's about all.